Chesterton once said, "Education is simply the soul of a society as it passes from one generation to another." Tonight, I'd like to look at the changes, not just in education, that is, the passing of this soul from one generation to the next, but also the changes in the role that parents have played in this process over the last 3 generations, particularly during the transition from high school to college. I'll do this in 2 parts. First, a simple look at the changes themselves. Second, a look at the cultural shifts that have influenced these changes, or as Chesterton might put it, a look at the soul that was being passed from generation to generation. I'll conclude with some thoughts guided in part by Chesterton again about moving forward and recovering a lost soul. First, a word about me to put this talk into context. I have worked in higher education for over 40 years. That's primarily why I have no hair. Prior to that, I attended colleges, universities for 11 years and high school for 4 years. In addition, I came from a family in which all 6 children attended college. 3 of us went on to do graduate work, all 3 achieving terminal degrees in our fields. Also, I've interviewed several individuals who attended college in the generation prior to mine. So I acknowledge that this is not a clinical study, just personal observations, but observations based on many years in the field. In any case, I hope you'll find it to be an interesting and informative ride. Let's begin. It's 1955. Eugene is 18 years old. His father says to him, "Gene, it's about time you thought about your future. I think college would be a good idea for you. Also, you're good at math and science. Something in that line would be a good fit for you. There's a drug manufacturing company here in town. You could study pharmacy and work there. Fordham University is a Jesuit school. They would give you a good education and preparation. I think you should go there." Gene says, "Okay." A few years later, in 1962, a similar conversation happens between Patricia and her dad. Dad says, "Pat, my sisters went to Trinity College. It's a good school, and it's near where your aunts live. You could go there and stay in their home, which would save us some money for your 5 siblings when they go to college." Pat says, "Okay." A conversation 2 years later, in 1964, unfolds in much the same way. Joe's dad says that he wants Joe to attend Wheeling College, and Joe agrees. A side note here. During the 1950s and early 1960s, most students attended colleges within a few hours' drive of home. This changed in the 1960s during the Vietnam War. Colleges were filled to capacity with young men looking for academic deferments, and these young men traveled farther and farther from their homes to get these deferments. So it's now 1969, the end of the decade. My father takes me to visit a few colleges, some of which I had researched and some of which he suggested. He never gives me an ultimatum, but the implied message that I hear is that the school should be Catholic, unless it be the local state university, or I go into the military before college, both of which would save money. We can see that there's a shift taking place, one in which the student is starting to assume more of the decision-making in the college search process. To compound this, in the 1970s, air travel was becoming more common, and the path to more distant colleges that had been forged by the deferment seekers of the 1960s continued. 2, students were taking a greater role in the decisions about college. School counselors were expanding their roles in guiding students in these decisions. Now it is 1977. Tom is a senior in high school, and his father sits him down for a conversation about college. Tommy says, "As you begin to think about colleges this year, here are some parameters I want you to keep in mind. it must be a Catholic college. It should give you a good preparation for a career, and we must be able to afford it. Also, I will expect you to work part-time to help us cover some of the costs. There's no mention that the college should be close to home. Over the next few months, Tom researches schools, talks with his high school counselor, and visits some campuses with his parents. The final decision is something of a joint decision, a school that he likes and one of which his parents approve. This process of giving more and more of the decision-making power about college choices to the students continues to progress through the following decades. I'll jump now to the present. Our experience at the Collegium today is largely that students are given most, if not all, of the decision-making authority about colleges. Parents may have some guidelines. For example, it should be a Newman Guide college. Parents also seem to fall into two camps with regard to involvement in the process. Some are completely hands-off. You are 18, you're an adult, this should be your decision. Others are quite involved, but not as decision makers, rather as advocates, helping their children get all the items on their college wish lists, which get longer and longer with more and more amenities. It also seems that parents and students have a difficult time prioritizing those wish lists. For example, we want the traditional Latin Mass, I'll use the word TLM, sports teams, Socratic method teaching, a debate club, a pretty campus, a specific size of school, and a generous financial aid. This would be a small list. All of these items are given pretty much equal weight. It's ultimately a matter of which school can provide the highest number of these items. A school with 6 of these items, but not the TLM, would be rated higher than a school with a TLM but a smaller total number of amenities. I should probably say a word about the TLM, the traditional Latin Mass itself. Here too, its presence is enough to check off a box on the wish list. The culture that surrounds the TLM, the soul that is being transmitted, is not really considered. The culture, even the teaching, may be completely out of alignment with his family's culture, morals, and so on, but that is acceptable as long as the TLM itself, the Mass itself, the item on the wish list, is available. To summarize its evolution, we've gone from a decision-making process that was entirely in the hands of the students to one that is now almost entirely, that was entirely in the hands of the parents to one that is now almost entirely in the hands of the students. The role of parents has evolved from decision-making either to avoiding the decision-making at all or supporting their children in the children's own decision-making. Now, of course, this does not describe every family. It's simply an outline of general trends. I'd like to go back and review this timeline from the vantage point of societal culture. What is happening in the society at large while this evolution is occurring? Or to put it in a Chestertonian frame, what is happening to the soul of the society that is being transmitted? We'll start with Catholicism in the 1950s. World War II changed dramatically the degree to which Catholics engaged non-Catholics. During the war, people of all faiths joined together to fight a common evil enemy. Catholic soldiers dug into foxholes and, depending on their buddies to stay alive, did not worry about what religion the men next to them professed. Even so, in the 1950s, Catholics were largely a segregated group in society. Even mixed marriages were few and far between. We had our own churches, schools, hospitals, sports leagues, societies for men and women, youth organizations, and more. All of these facets of the church were staffed and run by priests or women religious. all of whom had had similar teaching and formation. The teaching and formation of parishioners, therefore, the passing on of the soul of the organization, were also uniform. As a result, we Catholics were a homogeneous group. When we sat in the pew at Mass, it was an easy bet that the people on either side of us, if our family didn't take up the whole pew, believed the same things we did. When our children went to a friend's house on a Friday, we did not have to worry that the family might serve meat. Or if our friends took a group of children to the movies, we would be confident that it would be in the A category of the Legion of Decency list. Of course, there were some folks who were not part of this homogeneity. For example, there were certainly families that practiced contraception, but such matters were kept private. This is also not to deny that there were problems that would result in the revolution of the 1960s. However, for the average Catholic, there was a clear consistency in church teaching and practice. People did not choose which Mass to attend because they wanted garage band music or organ music or English or Spanish or even, heaven forbid, Latin. Masses were all the same. Society at large had some similarities to this consistency in Catholic life. There was what we could call a generally accepted civic morality, particularly regarding sexual morality. Protestants might eat meat on Friday, but they would agree with Catholics on what constituted pornography. Roles in society were well understood and respected. For just one example, in my first grade class, there were 82 children and one teacher, a sister. Today, this would be unimaginable, but then it worked well, at least in part because we children understood and respected our role in the societal hierarchy. In this context, it would make sense that parents made the important decisions, such as what college a child would attend. The 1960s ushered into society a revolution that will probably be rated by historians as equal to or greater than the Millennium and the Protestant Revolt regarding its impact on culture, on the soul of society. This revolution was technological, it was educational, and it was behavioral. With reference to technology, we were at the beginning of technological changes that continue to evolve at breathtaking speed. At that time, perhaps the most critical technological development with regard to this topic was the widespread use of television. Yes, TV was mass-produced in the later 1940s and it became popular in the 1950s. But by the 1960s, most people had TVs in their homes, and such things as the Second Vatican Council, political debates, and countercultural musical groups such as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were becoming everyday parts of family life. The home, wherein the father had been truly a patriarch, was invaded by an outside force that brought varying points of view to the family discussion. Regarding education, the now infamous 1967 Land O'Lakes Statement, which was a declaration of the independence of Catholic universities from authority of whatever kind, lay or clerical, that was external to the academic community itself, was a major force in the secularization of Catholic colleges and universities. Patrick Riley, president of the Cardinal Newman Society, states, "Over the course of just a few years following the statement, most Catholic colleges and universities in America shed their legal ties to the Church and handed their institutions over to independent boards of trustees. In the quest for secular prestige and government funding, many went so far as to remove the crucifixes from their classroom walls and to represent their Catholic identity in historical terms, such as in the Jesuit tradition." The wound of secularization deepened over the next few decades. Many Catholic colleges and universities weakened their core curricula in favor of the Harvard model of electives and specializations, adopted a radical notion of academic freedom, embraced relativism and political correctness, and largely abandoned the project of forming young people for Christ outside the classroom. With reference to behavior, so we had technology and education, and now with reference to behavior, perhaps the most critical development, again with regard to this topic, was the widespread use of the birth control pill. This was the catalyst for the sexual revolution. Mary Ann Faithfull, who had been rock legend and sexual deviant Mick Jagger's girlfriend in the late 1960s, was asked decades later her thoughts about the cause of the sexual revolution. She said without hesitation, it was the pill. We no longer had to be responsible for our actions. However, the sexual revolution was more than the simple medical advancements that brought about the birth control pill. Jennifer Morse demonstrates in her book, The Sexual State, that the sexual revolution was the interlocking of three ideologies. The ideology of contraception, in which sex is separated from childbearing, the ideology of divorce, in which sex and childbearing are separated from marriage, and the ideology of gender, a more recent and culminating addition to the ideologies of the revolution, in which all distinctions between men and women are eliminated, except those that individuals explicitly embrace. Let me venture aside for just a moment. This characterization of the societal revolution just scratches the surface. If you'd like a more in-depth study of the forces that have risen to destroy society, men, women, and above all the family, I can recommend to you a book, a brand new book, called The Death of Women by Carrie Gress. It's a remarkable study of all these evil forces. Back to my story. Under the influence of everything that television brought into society, the secularization of Catholic colleges and universities, and the sweeping changes of the sexual revolution, pillars which had supported society for ages began to crumble. The A of authority was viewed as a scarlet letter. Everything old or traditional was questioned. Jack Weinberg, a political activist of the era, said in 1964, "Never trust anyone over 30." Even the church, the most hierarchical institution in the world, began to attempt a kind of decentralization with the establishment of bishops' conferences in 1965. Indeed, even the church, that since the 4th century had built an unapologetically Catholic culture through her music, architecture, art, scientific, mathematical, and other developments, and had questioned cultural developments that came from outside, embraced the New Age. The church's music, art, architecture, even her worship, the Mass and the Divine Office, were radically changed, embracing the latest whims of a society out of control. It was in this context that parents began, slowly at first, to relinquish the decision-making authority around colleges. After all, what parent would want to be seen as an unloving authoritarian has-been? The cultural revolution of the 1960s has not stopped. Indeed, its rate of change has increased. Who would have imagined that in the space of about 15 years, we would move from the leaders of our country condemning same-sex marriage to the Supreme Court declaring that it is a constitutionally protected right? It's not necessary for me to detail the failings of contemporary society. You, as parents, are well aware of them. However, I would characterize things by saying that Western society has all but collapsed. Even the church, at least the current leadership of the church, has continued to embrace the whims of modern culture regardless of their contradiction to the perennial teachings of the Church. Those teachings that for centuries carefully passed on the soul of the Church and the society she built from generation to generation. Let me move now to the crux of this story. In the 1950s, when society was relatively stable and morally intact, even if a student were left completely on his own with regard to making a decision about college, the risk of a very bad decision, at least to his moral formation, was relatively low. If there were a time when parents did not need to be as directive as they were about college decisions, it was then. However, parents were directive because that's the way society worked then. Today, the risk of a student making a very bad decision about college, especially regarding his moral formation, is very high. Even most so-called Catholic colleges are Catholic in name only. There is no guarantee that a Catholic college will foster a child's continued growth in virtue and holiness. Yet, this is the time when parents are the least likely to exert guidance, or perhaps I should say their rightful authority, in this matter. As Chesterton put it, the only people who seem to have nothing to do with the education of their children are the parents. As society has turned upside down, so too have the ways in which parents exercise their proper authority. Now, it would be improper for me to leave the matter hanging like this with an open criticism. I should offer some remedies, which I do out of rightful obligation, not so much because I have all the answers. My children went to college in the late 80s and early 90s. There was some semblance of the faith in some schools, but you had to seek it out. Thanks be to God, both of them finished school with their faith intact. However, what they were not prepared to handle, and what we were not prepared, or what we had not prepared them to handle, was the relentless pressure and the crushing weight of a godless culture beyond college. Today, they are part of the Church's extinct age group. Would I send my children to those schools where I sent them 20 to 25 years ago? No. Would I encourage them to pursue the arts-related fields that they pursued? In the case of one, I'm not sure. In the case of the other, probably not. But I honestly don't know how someone can pursue any art field today in an intense way without entering into a lion's den of iniquity. All of this is to say that I am not an expert. I cannot look at you and say, if you do this, everything will turn out well. Here's what I can say about what I would do if I were doing it again in this time and culture. It's my list of 10. 1. Pray, fast, and sacrifice intentionally. 2. Ask your children to do the same. When your children see that you fast, pray, and sacrifice for them, it will change the way they view this entire subject. 3. Inform yourself. Keep in mind that this is your child's most vulnerable time. If they are going to lose the faith, this is statistically the most likely time for that to happen. Generally, students have a high degree of respect, even reverence, for college professors, who in turn have an enormous amount of influence on students. It is critical that your children have professors that will teach and model the faith. You should not have to pick good ones and avoid bad ones. The bad apples will affect the entire barrel. They all should be teachers who strive to live the faith. 4. Think twice about credentialism, college education that is nothing more than technical training, that is, an education that feeds the body or the mind but neglects the soul. 5. Discuss these issues with your children. Let them know your desire that they have a happy, productive lives in which they grow in holiness and virtue and get to heaven. 6. Related to this, prioritize that college wish list. And this is an A and B number. A, the number one goal is heaven. Nothing should compete with this. If you are not confident that a college will improve your child's chances to get to heaven, you should not consider it at all. No long list of amenities is worth losing heaven. And B, after this, everything is secondary, but it's worth prioritizing the secondary items. Take that laundry list of items and assign a number to each. Then line them up and study them. Is a sports team really worth a 5 out of 5? Well, maybe it is, but at least be honest about it. 7. Also related to this, take a hard look at the curriculum. If education is, as Chesterton says, merely truth in the state of transmission, then we need to start by teaching the truth. And I'm not referring to political truths, but to Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. Everything in the curriculum must ultimately lead to a better understanding of and a closer relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, when I make this remark, which is general in nature, I'm always asked for particulars, so I will give you a few. Theology courses that emphasize people such as Hans von Balthasar, Teilhard de Chardin, Karl Rahner should raise red flags. Philosophy courses that emphasize subjects such as expressionism, immanentism, subjectivism, relativism, anything that looks to deconstruct cultural mores should also raise red flags. Number 8, also take a hard look at the role of tradition. This summer, after our summer week, I was taking a student to the airport. At one point, she talked about how everything changes so rapidly. Musical tastes, technology, popular apps, fashion, everything. It was as if nothing was stable. It was a revealing statement. Your children are raised in an environment where it seems as if nothing is stable. And this is where the philosophy of modernism takes hold. Because nothing is stable, truths have to be redefined to accommodate current realities. This is modernism. This is their world. In his article, Modernism, It's All About Me, Myself, and I, Peter Stockland says, a deep cultural rumbling Chesterton recorded was modernity's movement toward moral self-immolation disguised as moderate progress, that is, this constant instability. As long ago as the early 20th century, Chesterton was cautioning against consumerist culture capacity to destroy age-old moral truths and traditions. He warned that people should not be too preoccupied with totalitarian menaces such as socialism, because the next great heresy was going to be an attack on morality, especially sexual morality. The locus of that would be Manhattan rather than Moscow, he said. Chesterton was aware of structures and their importance. He understood that most people borrow their ways of thinking and behaving from the cultures they're immersed in. In the church, we use the term lex orandi, lex credendi. If the culture becomes toxic, you find that people who 40 years earlier would never dream of approving of abortion suddenly can't quite see what's wrong with it. Or people who 15 years ago would never have dreamed of approving same-sex marriage and now can't see what's wrong with it. When a people cannot tell its traditions from next Tuesday, when they believe their theology is indistinguishable from a theory they heard last Thursday, then a cultural toxicity is well and truly progressing through us. More than anything, our children need to see that there are unchanging truths. God does not change. Truth does not change. what is objectively good and what is objectively evil do not change. And hand in hand with this, we need to help them to cultivate a sense of gratitude for tradition and for the past. Woke culture feeds on cultivating resentment. Cultivating gratitude allows a more critical, more sane critique of the past. To send a young person into this world without a refined sense of gratitude is like leading a lamb to the slaughter. It is an essential part of our armor. It is a lens that exposes much of the world's heresy today. Chesterton again reminds us, tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. There is only one place where our children will see, learn, and embrace this gratitude: unchanging Catholicism. I don't mean just the traditional Latin Mass. That's a start, but it's also everything that the TLM represents. Every place it takes us, spiritually and theologically, every way in which it challenges us. It's not just the Mass, it's the life. I say this because I believe that just having the TLM, the traditional Mass, available on a campus is not enough. It has to be a traditional culture too. Now, I don't mean living like the Amish and spurning all modern conveniences, even though there is some merit to this way of life. I mean embracing the unchanging teaching of the Church as well as the unchanging liturgy. So 9, look at the totality of the college experience, its integration, the curriculum, tradition, activities, social life, everything. To quote Chesterton again, every education teaches a philosophy, if not by dogma, then by suggestion, by implication, by atmosphere. Every part of that education has a connection with every other part. If it does not all combine to convey some general view of life, it is not education at all. And 10, finally, and I say this with some trepidation because my job is to recruit students, I think a gap year before college is, in many cases, a good idea. It gives a student a little time to mature, to grow in the faith without all the busyness and distractions of school life, and some time to earn some money, to experience real work, which is itself maturing and spiritually beneficial. The college choice then becomes something more deliberate and not just something to do because it's the typical expected step after high school. As I said earlier, I don't propose these as a perfect solution. They are things that I would do if I were doing all this again with the 40 years of experience I've had in the field and knowing what I now know. Perhaps you can take some pieces of this and help pass the soul of society, that is, a soul grounded in the unchanging truth that is Jesus Christ, and pass it to the next generation. Thank you.